Hello, everybody. I'm very happy to welcome you to the Taubman College of Architecture and Urban Planning, and also welcome you to the kickoff of Building Better Futures, Innovation and Equitable Development. So a number of people have asked me what equitable development is. I would say there's no one answer, so maybe we'll figure it out tomorrow. But I think it's best achieved in collaboration and best measured after it's completed, because it requires an understanding of history, of communities, of the way policies and finance and design can improve lives for a broad range of people, both in and around the development, but also in the ways policy and finance has failed us in the past. Understanding that helps us to understand how we can build equitably. So it includes outcomes not just related to the number of housing units or jobs provided, but also better health outcomes, better access to opportunity, and agencies for those working, visiting, inhabiting, and those who predate the developments. A multitude of sectors play a role in creating equitable outcomes, and you'll hear tonight and tomorrow some of the people at the forefront of innovation in the field. I'm happy that Carlo Ratti is kicking this event off. He works at the intersection of design, planning, technology, and engineering, and he's completed projects all over the world. I'm also excited that we have so many presenters from around the US and Canada coming tomorrow, who will be in dialogue with developers, designers, planners, and policymakers from Michigan that you'll also hear from tomorrow. I want to thank the administration here at Taubman for supporting this event, this is coming at a very important moment in our cities where we face the promise of technology and new mechanisms for creating wealth, but also lingering, growing gaps in income and opportunity. I want to thank especially Katie Cole, who has organized this whole event masterfully. I also want to thank our partners in this conference, including Poverty Solutions here at the university, ULI Michigan, and the Ross School of Business Michigan Real Estate Club. I also want to thank my colleagues here in urban planning, architecture, and urban design, and my advisory committee. I also want to thank Robert Goodspeed, assistant professor in urban planning, who's going to introduce Carlo Ratti. Robert?
Mark told me you'd speak for like 2 minutes. I think you hit the mark. So hello everyone, my name's Robert Goodspeed, and I think I've been asked to provide this introduction for 2 reasons. One, we tried to get Carlo to come to the college event. Some of you may have attended last fall about shaping future cities, very much about new technology and smart cities. And for scheduling reasons, we couldn't make that happen. So I think it's kind of a great fit that he's here today, a segue from that event to the event that we'll have tomorrow. The other reason is my PhD degree is from the department that houses his lab at MIT. I didn't work in his lab. I think that's a good thing, and you'll see why once you see how demanding some of the work is. But did cross paths with him, learn about the work mostly through some of my PhD colleagues who were in the lab. And so what I've decided to do is I want to introduce the work by telling you 3 things about it from my point of view that I think will be a nice preface. The first is that the Senseable City Lab projects I find extraordinarily eclectic, and they span from doing simulation modeling of mobility systems, tracking garbage in Seattle, and even sensing the contents of our sewers. And he might highlight some of those projects among many others. And so clearly these projects completely ignore any nice disciplinary boundaries that we're aware of in our college or even in our cities. Such that clearly the goal is much broader. I think the second is these projects are executed with the most impressive technical and scientific rigor. And the surprising thing, every project you'll see publications in top engineering scientific journals arising out of the work. So it's not only evocative design demonstrations, it is rigorously rendered, conceived, and implemented. And then the third thing about it, and as a PhD student, people hear what I was doing, where I was, absolutely everybody knows about it. I met people, the only thing they knew about MIT, it seemed, was Senseable City Lab. The work has drawn extremely broad broad attention, and I've come to appreciate that's really part of their method. And so I think I finally discovered or reflected on what they were doing through a book they published called The City of Tomorrow that I highly recommend. And in it, he describes with a co-author, Matthew Claudel, still a PhD student there, that what they were doing and what they aspire to do, they describe as futurecraft, and that is introducing new ideas into the ecology of the city, and to paraphrase, that it's not about fixing the present or predicting the future, but instead influencing it. And they make the point that by virtue of being stated, explored, and debated, a concept will make an impact, and conclude our work is meaningless unless it ignites imagination and provokes debate. And so already you're thinking, monitoring our sewer, should we do that? Is that a good idea? He's already succeeding in his fabulous lab. So join me in welcoming Carlo Ratti for what I'm sure will be an exciting talk.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Good evening, everybody. Great pleasure to be here with you tonight. Initially, when we talked about coming here last fall, it was I had prepared a presentation on sensible cities more generally, and today I try to select some projects that I think take. What I would say is would be my interpretation tonight of equitable development as looking at people and try to better understand people's behavior in cities. Clearly, just a partial view of what you will be discussing tomorrow, but that's what I wanted to do tonight. The other thing I wanted to mention is that again, because I think there's many people with different interests here, I'll keep it quite short. I got a lot of slides, but I think I'll do a break in the middle, and then we can have a bit of discussion, and maybe I'll select different projects based on some of the things you are interested in. So let's keep it more interactive and like a conversation instead of just myself flooding you with 300 slides. So I want to start with this quote from Cerdà. As you know, Cerdà is the father of modern Barcelona. He was active in the 19th century. He wrote his great book about the general theory of urbanization in the second half of the 19th century. At the time he was saying, the building in cities, if it is not so already, will soon become a genuine science, calling for major and profound search in every branch of human knowledge, and most especially into social science. So he was dreaming about a time where we might be able to look at the city in a different way. Not only the physical city he was building, that's his legacy, the beautiful city of Barcelona we all know, and a beautiful city that he designed like this, but he was dreaming about being able to see how people behave in the city, to look at, at the human side of things and look at, not only the physical city, but also the city that we all inhabit, dynamic city that we shape every day just with our presence. And so he was doing this in the second half of the 19th century, but really his tools were still a little bit the way of mapping the city that had been used before. Most of you know this is the Nolli's map of Rome, 1748, where you actually see the building, you see the geometry, you see public space and private space, but a way to describe the city just in terms of measure of what is built. But many people tried then to look at other components. This is Camillo Sitte at the end of the 19th century was still looking at the city as a physical artifact, but at the same time he was trying to imagine how people would enjoy the space in actually lines of sight and basically how we visually perceive that space. And Camillo Sitte clearly had a lot of legacy, and at MIT, for instance, Kevin Lynch did a lot of analysis again about how we move through the city, how we create an image of the city, and how we experience it. Now, over the past few decades, we started developing new tools also to analyze the city. That's some of the work I did in my PhD at Cambridge. And what we're doing here was actually looking at lines of sight. So again, a bit rethinking Kevin Lynch at measuring the length of views and trying to see how different objects might stick out of the city and so on. So all of this has led to the ability to measure some of the things that Cerdà was dreaming about. But I would argue that in the past 20 years, everything has changed. In the past 20 years, everything has changed and is changing because of this. Because we are creating like a hybrid world in between digital and physical. We are layering our cities with networks, with sensors and so on. And for the first time, actually, in real time, we can capture what is going on with this kind of dynamic, fluid essence of the city. If you want, you can say the internet is becoming Internet of Things, is entering physical space, the space of buildings, so the built environment, and is producing a massive amount of data that allows us to see the city in a way we couldn't before. For instance, we can see a city like this. That's a visualization that was done by Pedro Cruz from our lab at MIT. It was a MoMA in New York, but that's a city of Lisbon, captured using billions and billions of data points collected from the taxi network. We couldn't see a city like this 20 years ago, but we can today. And so I think, what I wanted to share with you tonight is some of the work we're doing about this, about how today we can capture the more human dimension of the city, something that we couldn't measure before, and hopefully can help us to build more cities for people and more equitable cities tomorrow. Now, we're doing this mostly at MIT, a Senseable City Lab. We're in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and also got a small lab in Singapore. MIT has a large research operation there. We got a small team looking at cities there. Also with our design office in New York, in Italy, in London, and with some of the startups that came out of both of them over the past 5 years. I want to start with one of the oldest projects we did. And in this project was at the Venice Biennale, in a pavilion there. The Venice Biennale, as you know, is an exhibition about art and architecture every couple of years in Venice. This was 2006, so very old, is now 13 years ago. The curator of the Venice Biennale that year was Ricky Burdett from the London School of Economics, and he gave us a pavilion. And what we did there, we tried something that hadn't been done at the time yet. It was map a city in real time using all the signals we generate through our smartphones. So basically trying to look at people and how they move and what they do by looking at this information. That information had not been used for doing this. Now it's very common. If you just open a Google map, you see, for instance, there's a traffic jam. That's done using a lot of this data that's collected through cell phone probes. But at the time, it hadn't been done. And actually, some of the papers and the things we published at the time are still used today for some of the analysis that become very, very common. So I'll show you that that was a pavilion we had. And what we did this summer, we established a system. We would get real-time data from the city of Rome, because this was in Venice at the Biennale. So we decided to pick an Italian city, the Italian capital. So we're collecting real-time data from the city of Rome, data from all of the cell phones in the city, from millions of people, the largest cell phone provider in the country. In an anonymized and aggregated way, we would send them to servers we set up at MIT. There we would use artificial intelligence to analyze it and to visualize it, and then we would send it in real time, near real time, to the Venice Biennale, in short, at the Venice Biennale. Now, if you're interested in some of the technology, I'll show some of the papers tonight. They're all available on our website, so you can actually just download them and look at that. But we call it mobile landscapes, so basically using cell phone data to describe the city. I'll show you, for instance, the type of data we were collecting. And I'll show a very special moment that happened that summer. That was 2006. It was the summer of the soccer World Cup. It's a bit like the equivalent of the Super Bowl in the US, the World Cup for soccer. And actually that year, it was in Germany. In the final, it was France and Italy playing. And in the end, actually, it was quite surprising, Italy won. Look at what happened in terms of people's activities and movement in the city of Rome that day, using all this data collected from networks in the city. So what you see here, oops. Well, sorry, that always works, but we tried it before. Just a second, I'll. Apologies, we tested before. I think there's a problem with the link, but we should be fine in a moment. Let me get it from an address. You know, technology. I just showed the video from another presentation. Sorry, the link broke down. We tested. So here you see it. So that's the city of Rome. You see the Colosseum, the river. That's the morning or the day of the final. So you see the moment people waking up and going here and there. Doing different activities in different parts of the city. It's the afternoon, still before the match. That's activities and how people move and behave. The match begins silence. Nobody talks anymore. France scores, Italy scores. half time, people make a quick call. Second half, end of normal time, first overtime, second overtime, a famous headbutt by Zidane, the player, and finally, Italy wins. And that night, everybody went to celebrate in the center. You see it here. The following day, again, the winning team went back from Germany, went to the city center. It met with the prime minister and a big crowd. Did you see there? By the end of the day, actually, the crowd moved to that other part of the city, in the lower part called Circo Massimo, where since Roman times, actually, Romans go and celebrate. So you see a big peak there by the end of the day. Going back to the other presentation. Yeah, so really that was about the first time we used all this data, in this case, to understand how people use and move through the city. Again, I believe that somebody like Serdar would be very excited to see actually how you can measure that and use that as an input for planning the city, or also see how his planning would actually change and affect the flows of people in the city. But you can do other things with the data. For instance, you can look at communities. So that's another paper we did a few years later. We built another network. In this case, it was a network based on landlines. It was the largest ever social network being built, in this case, with non-internet social network being built. Around 50 million people connected in the UK. And here we're working with the Prime Minister's office in the UK, who was interested really in communities, and also looking at how we could redraw constituencies in a better way. Again, we couldn't get this information in the past. You know, the way we would draw constituencies was based on traditional geography and, traditional old boundaries in the city. So what we did, we created this network, and then we started asking mathematically, you can say like this, given a geographical area, and some measure the strength of links between its inhabitants, how can we partition that area into smaller, non-overlapping regions, minimizing disruptions to people's links? So how can we look at communities over that space? And then we started looking at this at a broader scale, and then, in an iterative way, going to the smaller scale, from the scale of, say, Scotland and the UK, all the way to the scale of constituencies. Trying to look at the country in a different way, and communities in a different way, in a bottom-up way, based on the links that actually measure how we are all connected to each other. So here is a short video that tells you the analysis we did and kind of the results we found. So what you see here is really like a different kind of geometry emerging at different scales, which is not based on the past, on politics, on history, but really on the natural way we all connect with each other. And again, for us, it's an experiment of how we can better understand communities today through the data, through the signals we send out. And actually that led to a follow-up paper, which is this one, where we actually look at different city sizes and how we connect in different cities in different ways. And what we realized, some of you might be familiar with the work of Geoffrey West. Geoffrey is a physicist. He's at the Santa Fe Institute, and he did a lot of work on the scaling of cities and how different things scale with city size. So if you take a city and you double the size, some of the things grow in a superlinear way, so more than double, and some other things grow in a sublinear way. And so one of the things we found also is that the structure of the social network changes radically between small and big cities. Actually, what you see here is Portugal, one of the smallest cities in Portugal, Lisha, and Lisbon, the biggest cities, and how we organize ourselves. Again, the idea that this information can help us better understand the human fabric of the city. And again, if you're a planner, then this information can be very important in the way we shape, structure the public spaces and the other spaces in the city. I'll share with you also some work we are doing right now that's we're just starting to publish. This started kind of a year and a half ago when the King of Belgium came up, asked us a question, King Philip. The question was, well, Brussels is an amazing city. But Brussels also, he mentioned something I didn't know, is one of the cities with the highest number of foreign fighters per capita, people who went to fight for ISIS over the past, I believe, 5 years. And so we started, and the question was, what is going on in the city? I mean, how is it that so many people actually are going to fight? And what's going on in terms of communities? And so what we started doing is, again, using similar data about data collected from cell phone networks. In this case, we looked at Singapore. We started looking at Singapore data, so that's the first paper. But in order to see how we could measure segregation in cities. And how can you measure? You can measure it in two ways. If you go cell phone data, what you know is how people connect on the social network, on the human network and the communication network, so when we connect and talk to each other, so links that are based on communication, but also approximately in an anonymized way how people move through the city. So you can say that we see how we are connected in digital space because we connect, but also how we are connected in physical space because we share the same place, the same square, we share a similar part of the city and so on. And actually, so this was the first paper that was published last year. The most interesting results are not published yet. And what they do actually, what they show is something that we find quite interesting. We still need to validate it, but I'll tell you just with words. You find in most cities, I would say in almost every city, including healthy cities, what you see is that if you plot income on the x-axis, and if you plot segregation on the y-axis, you got a line that goes up. And what it tells you is that basically if you are, some of the people with higher income, they tend to be more segregated, but still, there's everybody else is trying to reach out to the whole community. However, in a few cities, and those usually are the cities where you really then measure other type of social issues, you see the curve doesn't become like a line that goes up, it becomes like a V shape, which means that also people with very low income are very segregated. And actually what happens is Brussels is quite similar. You got parts, such as a neighborhood called Molenbeek in the city center, where you got a lot of recent immigrants and so on who are not integrating, even from the city center, with the rest of the community. It's almost like you've lost hope to integrate with a broader social fabric. And the other thing you see is that if you look at that V shape, another problem is that usually the thinning of the middle class, the thinning of the middle class, kills that glue that actually traditionally was combining and keeping together the different people with different incomes and all of society. So we're still working on that. We are collaborating with a few economists and sociologists to analyze the data, but it's something we're quite excited at the moment. Again, the same principle, how today we can measure things we couldn't just 20 or 30 years ago, and hopefully get a better understanding of the way cities bring us together. Now, I want to finish this part about data with some of the work we've been doing on our own campus. So what you see here is the MIT campus, like a small city in the city. You've got Boston downtown. I'm sorry, it looks a bit like post-nuke. I mean, Boston is very green, but it's a winter picture. MIT, like a small city inside the city. Harvard up there. And MIT was one of the first universities to be totally covered with Wi-Fi in the early 2000s. And so we started seeing how that was changing human behavior. So, people used to work like this, as you see to the left, and now tend to work, as you see there to the right. And I'm sure you're all familiar with the transformation that has been happening in all university campuses and in society at large. Now, these two pictures are a bit extreme. To the left, I picked the most depressing computer room I could find. To the right is a beautiful sunny day. I need to tell you, last week was not the same. With winter weather. But, it gives you a sense of the change, the same change we've seen in society at large. We used to work like this, even if this is Jacques Tati making fun in the movie Playtime of cubicles, but many people see around the world working cubicle, and now we tend to work like this. And the change that has been happening is really technology. Technology has liberated us. A few years ago, we were chained to a desk. We couldn't move, and that led to designing cubicles. So they were much more free and flexible. A lot of the tasks we used to do can be done in other places. So technology is the reason why we're changing our behavior. So our idea was if technology is changing this, what about measuring technology, the technological data, the data coming from the technological networks, in order to quantify what is going on? We're all familiar with this from a quantitative point of view. But if we can measure it and then use this information to design better spaces. So what we did, we went to the MIT ISNT system, and we got a map of all the Wi-Fi access points on campus, a few thousand of them. And then we started analyzing activity. Again, aggregated, anonymized activity on the system. So what you see here is actually the bubbles tell you how many people you have. And so here you see actually people waking up in the dorms, moving to other part of campus during the day, and you see how the density of people changes in the course of the day in different buildings. Now, if you look at the same thing at an aggregated level, for instance, this is something you could call the heartbeat of MIT. So what you see at the top, you see it's a Monday. You see people getting to campus around 9 a.m. Just a few people leaving at 4 or 5 p.m. 9 to 5 people you see there. But most of the people still working till very late at night. And even in the middle of the night, quite a lot of activity on the network. And the same thing happens on Monday, on Tuesday, on Wednesday, on Thursday. Not on Friday, where, like all over the world, activity slips away very quickly in the afternoon. And actually, Saturday and Sunday are almost like two normal days. You see all the baseline is pretty much the same. You just remove the 9 to 5 people. And something interesting, every Sunday night, you got a little spike, a little dent on the graph. You see that it's between 9 and 10 p.m. And that's when you say, oh my God, tomorrow is Monday again. And you remember all the things you haven't done before the beginning of the new week, so you go back to work. Now, the interesting thing is that you can do this for every room at MIT. And again, I think this is a kind of something that architects always dreamed about, this type of information. In the 1970s, there's amazing work that was done on what was then called post-occupancy surveys. We take a place, and after it's occupied, you see how people inhabit it. And that's very, very important, because then if you got the information, you can use it to design better the space or transform it over time. However, that information was very difficult to get. At the time, you had to do questionnaires and maybe interview people, and you would get 20 data points. You couldn't do it for 20,000 people on a campus and understand it. And I think that is what is becoming more and more possible. That, again, is part of that initial dream of Serda, of how this data can help us to better understand not only the physical city, but life inside it. So if you look at this, you see every room, how it's occupied. What is it that those curves show you time on the x-axis and how many people or how much activity you have. So again, tells you the occupancy profile, the signature of every space. You can tomorrow probably get it square meter by square meter about how space is occupied. And then again, you can analyze it. A lot of interesting things. You get big data, and then use that to run different type of algorithms to make sense of the data. Here we were just trying to look at frequencies, the Fourier transform, look at different type of clustering of the data. And for instance, if you look at communities of use on the MIT campus, you find a map such as this one. This map probably 20 years ago would have very separate colors on different buildings and very distinct. This map tells you different activities. Every color is a different activity profile, so how you're using that space. And in the past, every place had just one function. And what you're seeing here is actually how things are hybridizing, how the ability we have today to move and work in a much more free way is leading us to use space in a more flexible way, which is actually what happens around. I was here for a couple of hours this afternoon around this beautiful space. This space is not only a place for the meeting we have tonight, but also is a place where people work, looking at, it's almost like it has many functions going on at the same time. People having coffee there, working together. It's a meeting room. So it performs different functions that probably would not have been able to do some years ago just because we had the time to be attached to a desk with a desktop computer. We couldn't really be free as we are today in the way we work. So that is the analysis of how people are on campus, so in occupancy of space. Now we can do other things, and this is work in progress we are still doing. But what we can do is think about what's a great university or what's a great institution. It's nothing else. Think about us here tonight. It's nothing else that people connecting in physical space connecting digital space and trying to do something together. So making sure that together we are more than the sum of the individual parts. So somehow, again, physical connection, digital connections in trying to achieve something. For the first time, I would say we can measure all those three parameters. And I'm very excited because I think that can help us a lot to design better spaces as architects, as planners. How we can allow people to come together in a more effective way. So if you think about the university, one of the outcomes is papers and patents. So we started measuring that as well on the MIT campus. Clearly, it's not the only outcome, but one of the easily measurable ones. So you see for every building, actually patents per building and papers per building. Building 32 is computer science, very high density. Then you can look at also the community, how different communities come together. Some colleagues at MIT have been working a lot on the concept of collective intelligence and trying to measure it. And some of the things they've been finding is actually when you put together a community, especially if it's a diverse community, then the intelligence you measure in the group is superior than the one that you get from the individual parts. So there's a scaling effect which comes by coming together, and especially coming together with people, with diverse people. So what you're seeing here, we try to look at the heterogeneity per building. So how we got different communities collaborating and working together in that building. And again, you see that the building that had a very high productivity before is also one of the buildings with the highest heterogeneity in the building. And then we've been looking also at the digital network, a different type of digital networks. So for the first time, this is still work in progress. You can look at some of the first results in this paper, but this is still work in progress. I think we can measure both the physical interaction in space, the digital interaction in space, and also, what we do together. And we think that's going to be quite exciting as we can use more and more these parameters to better understand the community that lives, in this case, in a university, but more broadly in the city. Now, those were just the initial things I want to share with you more about using data. Again, the common thread is how we can use data to better understand the community at different scales in a city, in a building, on a campus. Now, I wanted to perhaps stop for a moment and see if there's any comments or questions so we can actually more decide. I had some slides more on the design work we do and how we try to include some of this in design. But I think it would be great to hear from you and have some comments, so maybe I can then look at different projects. Also, because before it was mentioned, I didn't include it tonight, but I can take it from another presentation. Some of the work we've been doing with waste and trash and so on also has very important consequences in terms of equality. So I can also show that instead. It would be great to hear, but it would be great to take a small pause and hear from you if any questions or comments. Yes?
So have you seen any big obstacles or it looks like you asked me to reflect on data. How easy has that process been or what are the obstacles in doing projects like that?
Yeah. It's great. Should I repeat the question? Everybody heard it. But basically, what are the obstacles about? We've been collecting huge amounts of data, so what are the obstacles about collecting data? I think, there's different types of data. Some of the data, actually, I didn't show it tonight. We got a lot of data that has been opened up. As you know, over the past probably 10 years, many cities and countries and governments have been doing a lot of open data policies. So there's a lot of data that is becoming more and more accessible through that. In other cases, the beginning with cell phone data, when we started, actually, it was, as I said, it was the first time the cell phone data was used to describe city, being used for urban studies. And it was quite difficult. We had to talk to a lot of cell phone providers, convince them, this was good for them as well, and so on. Today, you find also quite a few data sets that have been opened up with cell phone data. And a few providers actually have uploaded this for research. So more and more researchers are also using data that's accessible online. So I would say data is becoming more accessible. I think one of the difficult things, however, is how can you create a very interdisciplinary team to look at the data? It's not only about, you really need to have computer scientists or data people with a background in complex science, in analytics, working together with the architects, the designers, and so on. So I think that is one of the challenges because, there are different cultures, traditionally different departments. We speak different languages academically. And I think that's what we're trying to do at the lab, to bring different communities together. And I think the other important thing, I believe, is how you share this with the community at large. So sometimes for our projects, we say, sure, it's great to be published in a top journal, but I think the important thing is also how can we have a data visualization on the site on the website that many other people can use and look and leave feedback. So how can we create the feedback with the community? Again, this is data about the community. And if you do a visualization, it's not only to, to do a beautiful drawings and images. It's really in order to convey and communicate the science and the results with the broader community, who can then provide feedback. So it's by closing the loop with it. So I would say those are the key challenges. Data is becoming more and more accessible. However, a small point is that there's something I'm very concerned about. And at MIT, we've been running a forum twice called Engaging Data, with privacy advocates. Last time there was Noam Chomsky, with companies that use a large amount of data and so on. And the thing I'm concerned about is that until today, a lot of the data that was collected by companies was somehow available for research or for cities. But today you get to the point where this thing in your pocket, since you woke up, I guess everybody in the room has a smartphone, a few thousand data points were collected about you, about where you were, how you moved, if you're walking, cycling, on a bus, on a train. And that information today is captured in the cloud, but it's so fine-grained. And this has happened in such a short amount of time. When we started working with cell phone data before smartphone, you had 15 data points per day. Now, if you think about the operating system in your pocket is collecting, as I said, thousands of data points per day. And it's becoming so sensitive that actually this data nobody has access to. So this data potentially could revolutionize many dimensions of urban studies and more generally society, but is just locked in the cloud with some big private companies. So there's a few private companies in states that know everything about all of us, and we know very little about data and the data. So I think that's the thing I'm getting concerned more and more today, which has been happening, I would say, just since, really since smartphones, because that has been a game changer in terms of the amount of data that could be collected. Yes?
Saying a patent or an invention occurs in a building sounds strange. I would think that there'd be just as many from a coffee shop or restaurant or a bar as there is in a lab. How did you analyze that?
So you said, I missed the beginning of your question. Was it what a patent?
You said you identified buildings that were the most productive for patents or inventions.
Sure. Yeah.
And I've got to believe that a more
no, you're totally right.
downtown or a coffee restaurant bar might be just as productive as a lab.
You're absolutely right. I think, and this is a first approximation, but what you can do actually in many universities, and this has been studied as well in a quantitative way in Silicon Valley, for instance, the fact of the places where actually, again, if you look at this, usually it's the different communities coming together. And that's usually where serendipity happens and new ideas pop up. And so traditionally, even coffee places inside universities or outside universities are usually very creative places. Now, what we did here is analyze all the MIT campus. What is becoming more and more possible is to get this data on a larger scale, and then we would be able to also to measure what you're saying. I mean, it's a first approximation, but still, I would argue it's better than nothing in order to really understand human interaction and the consequences of it. Yes?
So you have been research in different countries, different places. So I wonder, have you? Yeah, thank you. So have you, I'm sure you have. So how have you been modifying your research methodology or the way you treat data, in these different contexts, different countries, different places? Can you give some examples about that?
Yeah. I think it's a very good question, and you're totally right. For instance, we had a few visiting students from China recently at the lab, and I think China has a totally different policies about data. Just sometimes they've been coming with a large amount of data, cell phone data and so on, that's been collected in the country in a way that you couldn't do in other countries because of different policies. For instance, I find very interesting what Europe has been implementing over the past year, which is called GDPR. Is a new way to deal with data that gives much more power to the individual to decide how to use the data. So I think your point is certainly there's the way you can access the data, the strings attached, the way you want to the way you want to analyze it. But first of all, the type of data you can get access to changes a lot between different cultures, different countries, and so on. I don't think there's a general answer, but certainly changes a lot. And what I see as I was saying, interesting about GDPR is that it puts much more power into people's hands about how they want to use their data. So we're also working a little bit with some European companies to see how that actually could allow different ways to get very interesting data, not through a big provider that collects it for all of us, but more through individuals who voluntarily want to contribute, for instance, to better understanding a city and voluntarily share their own information. Yes?
My question is, do those research have a bias on those people who do not use smartphones? This is my first question. My second question is, even those people who use smartphones, different people use the phone in a different way. Some people will use it more, some people use it less. And also, like, people come to the same place with different purposes. Can those cell phone data, like, you can identify those people come to the place, but how did you identify what kind of activity, what kind of interaction they did in that place?
Yeah, totally. I think, those are very important questions. I think almost every paper I showed has a section dealing with that. Those important questions for every social science paper or paper dealing with this. How representative your sample, how are you sampling a population in different ways? Are you excluding some communities? Now, this was particularly important at the beginning. The first paper is back in 2005 and 2006. At the time, cell phone penetration in this country was, I don't remember exactly, but I think it was much lower than 100%. Now we are at a time where on the planet we've got 7 billion people and we've got more than 7 billion phones. So things have changed so much. And for smartphones as well, in some countries you get to over 100% penetration. People have more than one smartphone on average in the pocket. So for the first point about the divide and the fact that somebody might not be on the system, again, you always need to look at that very carefully in every paper, but I think it's getting less and less of a problem. I think the second point you're saying also is very important. It's always something that you need to look at carefully. But again, there's different ways that people have developed in the social sciences in general to make sure that you're capturing the right variable you have identified. Again, it's and a lot of this is also work in progress. So we want to try new data and see what we can learn from it. Now, I didn't show it. Again, I'm thinking about what to show next, but we've been working a lot with app data as well. And for instance, app data, there's a piece of research we're quite excited about with app data, in particular, app that that monitors the steps and how you're walking in the city. There we are looking at other things that are more how we walk in cities and what are the environmental parameters that change the way we walk. And also, from a brain point of view, the fact that what we discover is that we are not following shortest path. We're not, we have got constant biases that hadn't been measured before, again, because we couldn't get access to the data. And so we're not following shortest path, and we're working with colleagues at Brain and Cognitive Science to try to understand really how our brain works and how we move in the city. Again, we find that is interesting if you think about a Kevin Lynch type of research in order to revisit it with this massive amount of information we have today. Yes?
The cell phones make a lot of sense since everybody's got them and they're giving off signal data. I was wondering if you're looking at any other sensors, maybe environmental quality, carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide, particulate matter, to get another picture of how the city functions.
Yeah, totally. So maybe let me share with you. This project. We're working on it at the moment, and here we are collecting data like this. I'll show you a little video. I'm just downloaded from, just getting it from the website is faster. But here it is. So we call it City Scanner, and what we did was develop a bunch of sensors that we put on garbage trucks, and then we use them in order to scan the city. And that's, just with 3 garbage trucks, it turns out, we can scan all of Cambridge at least once a week and get information about air quality, about potholes, again, about methane leaks, about energy leaks from buildings, about the presence of Wi-Fi signal, and so on. So let me show you briefly the video. Now, and then to follow up on this, so this is still, you know, basic information we can collect from the city. Maybe I'll show, I hadn't planned to show it, but I'll show the project we've been doing with waste and the sewage water. And again, you know, that's a very interesting way to look at the community and the people from a different lens. So I just need to open it. So, oops. So, and if you think about archaeology, you know, the way we look at an old civilization, often archaeologists look at a lot of the things that people had used and then have thrown away. You know, by looking at that, you really get a sense of you know, of that community and how they were living. And today we can, again, we can understand a lot of things about the city that we couldn't see before. And so this is about you know, different type of sensors. So call it the guts of the city. And again, if you look at this, this is John Snow's map of London, which was very important in order to understand the mechanism of transmission of cholera. And what he did, he looked at mapped cholera and wells, and actually realized that wells and water played a key role in the transmission of cholera, something that wasn't known at the time. So how can we do that in a similar way? The first project we've been doing is going into sewage and collecting samples of sewage and look at what is in sewage, so using sensors to see what is in sewage, to do some kind of real-time epidemiology. And you know, you all know that inside our body, for every cell in our body, we got 8 to 10 viruses and bacteria living with us. And we know also that that has been studied over the past few years, thanks to complete genomics, but it's not possible yet to measure and monitor it for all of us on a daily basis. But what we can do is look at the same thing, the microbiome, not on an individual scale, but at the scale of a neighborhood. So we went there and started looking at what goes on in sewage in order to understand something about the health of the community in that place. Now, we started manually, so with the mayor's office in Boston, going and, you know, opening manholes and going and getting, with a bucket, samples of sewage. We realized, you know, that was not great fun. So we went to knock at the door of our colleagues in computer science and say, can we do a little robot to do it? So this was the first version of a robot called Mar.io, like Super Mario, in order to collect the samples automatically. And you see here how it works, you know, with a filter and, you know, detects the water, does a bit of analysis there, and then, you know, then get samples that we can take to the lab. That was the second version we developed to the right to do this. I mean, this is just what it is in it, how it is made. You see all the different components. And what you get is all this data. You know, it's about all the viruses and bacteria in sewage. They can tell you interesting things about, you know, the kind of the health of a neighborhood. You can see epidemics before they happen because you find the influenza virus before the influenza epidemic has been reported. You also see very interesting things. By the way, you need to analyze all the sewage network to understand the community. When you're sampling a place, what is the community you're looking at? You can see also very interesting thing about antibiotic resistance. We've got a paper just going out now, but because you see antibiotic traces, you can find them, and you also see resistance in the sewage. So we've been doing all of this with colleagues at Biological Engineering. Incidentally, something we might discuss later is it ties in with some of the discussions we had this afternoon, and also what you were asking before about data. In this case, you know, probably was the widest collaboration with almost every single school on the MIT campus. You know, some people would go from biology all the way to civil engineering to study sewage, to many branches of engineering, computer science, and planning, all working together to do this. And again, you know, the problem about how you bring together different communities with different languages to do a project. The city becomes kind of the integrator for that. Here is a little video that shows the result. But there's also a startup, I'll show you in a moment, that came out of this. We started this 3 years ago. We're just finishing phase 1 of the project. game begins. So anyway, that's a thing. As I was saying, we started this as a research project. There's a startup that is now trying to do this for cities and help cities to look at different things, including one of the things we discovered that was not part of the initial research plan is that you get a lot of information about opioids consumption as well. And so they can help us if you're a city to understand, for instance, if some policies that are put in place against opioid consumption then, really have an effect, and you can measure that in real time with analysis of sewage. As you're into this, I'll show you briefly also about the project that was mentioned before about waste. And we got interested a few years ago into this thing. If you take the computer that you see here, today you know everything about it. Every chip in that machine, where it was produced, how it moved on the planet, how it became that computer. Now, the global supply chain, in other terms, is very well understood. But what happens to that machine when you stop using it? When you sell it and then somebody throws it away, is much less understood. This is what happens to a lot of electronics that we throw away. It ends up where it shouldn't. A lot of e-waste from the United States being shipped illegally to Asia, from Europe to Africa. So we said, what about analyzing this, analyzing better the removal chain, not the supply chain, but the removal chain. And if you look at it, how it was over 100 years ago in New York, will it look like this? And this is how it looks today, which is not very different. That's one of the waste management plants, the most sophisticated ones today. This is in Baltimore. If you look at it, you got a few sensors and a few ways of separating different type of waste, but the basic process is still not that different than what we saw before. There's many issues also related to the resilience of this. We always think, that we take it for granted that waste will disappear from our cities. But when that is not the case, we notice it quite quickly. There's also many issues about environmental justice. And for instance, if you look at this is not our work, but here you look at a map of toxic waste and race in the United States, and you see a very, very high correlation. In this map we did, that's a red and blue map of the United States. It's a different red and blue map, but it's not that different. It's what you have here is actually waste facilities in red and recycling facilities, landfills in red and recycling facilities in blue. And what do you notice? Any thoughts? Red and blue? Yes, I think I heard it there, but yes, the red and blue, and basically the blue is where you got big cities. And so you got a big city, usually the land is more expensive and we recycle more. If actually we're in the middle of the countryside, the land is so cheap, we throw things into landfill. So you see that highlights, and that's why I said it's not that different than the other red and blue map we often see, because cities also usually tend to be more blue and the countryside more red politically. But if you look at this, it's really based on density. So concentration of people, land is more expensive, and we recycle more. So our idea was very simple, was, can we actually develop a little sensor, put it on trash, and then start following trash around. And then we'll see what goes to shipment, to dump, to incinerate, to recycle. So we look at this kind of, not the supply chain, but the removal chain. We had to design the little tags in order to track the waste. So that was a bit like designing a small miniature cell phone. Just what it has to do, the battery has to last for many months. It only needs to record location and then send back that information. You also need to protect it, so we try different materials in order to make sure this wouldn't be crushed immediately when it gets into the truck. And then we look at finding a sample, again, the same problem as before, that's representative of consumption. The first deployment was in Seattle, so we really look at what people, we had 500 people, 3,000 pieces of trash, and try to have a representative sample of waste in the city. So we put a little tag on all of them. This story was very sweet. It was a young lady who came to us and said, that she had a new boyfriend. And at one point, the boyfriend said, it's either me or your old teddy bear. And she had the teddy bear for probably 10 years since she was very, very young. He said, okay, in the end, she opted for the boyfriend. But she said, at least I want to know where the last journey of my teddy bear. So we put a little tag in the teddy bear, and she could follow it and see where the teddy bear went. So anyway, we work with the whole community in Seattle, with kids and the whole community to put tags on waste. And here is the first deployment. Again, 500 people, as I said, 3,000 pieces of trash. And after tagging all of them, we started following them. So you see 3,000 objects. The day they were released in the environment in Seattle, the day of deployment. After a few days, you see some of the main landfills next to Seattle. But then a big surprise, how far stuff started to travel. Sometimes in crazy, unpredictable ways. Look at the trace went all the way to Chicago, changed its mind, and went back to California. And it's still moving after 1 month or 2 months. We thought the Farewell Symphony was the right music. So 4 lessons we learned from this. The first lesson is actually we can trace individual objects, and when you look at the energy we put into moving things, sometimes we put more energy than what we will ever recover by recycling. And you see, look at this rechargeable battery traveling for thousands of miles. Look at this, I showed you before, 2 cartridges. Both same origin, same destination, a recycling plant in Baja California, and following 2 totally different routes, moving for thousands of kilometers. We also discovered places such as this one. This is not an EPA authorized facility. It's actually a gravel extraction plant, and some waste was going there, and it should not have gone there. So we found a lot of tags reporting from that. We sent them an email. Of course, they replied saying, I don't know what you're talking about, but certainly there was something fishy going on. I mean, some waste was ended up where it should not have ended up. And then if you analyze and aggregate all the traces based on category, there's a few papers you find on the website if you're interested. You can really look at the fact that different categories travel different distances. E-waste and cell phone travel sometimes, that's in kilometers, over 1,000 kilometers and thousands of miles. And again, as I said, sometimes when you look at the energy necessary for moving them, that's more than what we will ever recover from by recycling them. Now, the other thing that's very important, that we found was very important to us, was that we were sharing all the information with the people. So like, the young lady with the teddy bear could follow the last journey of the teddy bear on the map, and then everybody could actually follow their waste on the map. And then we did a few questionnaires, and I think there's a couple of papers online that we did where we went and asked people, did this knowledge change your consumption patterns? And it turns out that in most cases it did. So basically, big data means we know more about the consequences of what we do, and then big data per se can be a very powerful agent of change. So it can actually tell us about the fact that what we do has an impact on the environment, and we might decide to consume or recycle in a different way. Actually, just a little anecdote. I remember this story from a lady who came to us and said, I used to drink water in plastic bottles every day and then throw them away and forget about them. And now, after the project, I know that those bottles go exactly to a landfill not that far from home. They will stay there forever, so stop drinking water in plastic bottles. So again, this idea that data per se can help us change cities through behavioral change. The third thing we discovered is that a lot of traces would end up at the edges of the United States. The reason is that in the first deployment, the little tracker we designed had inside a small SIM card. And as I said, it was like a miniature cell phone. But we thought it was not a good idea to deploy thousands of cell phones with an international roaming plan for months, right? So we only tracked inside the United States. We did a small partnership with Sprint, who gave us free connectivity inside the United States, but we lost track of all the things that went outside the US. So since then, over the past 5 years, we've been working on a follow-up deployment where we discover places such as this one in the middle of the jungle in Asia. If you go on our website, you see this was the biggest deployment ever of e-waste tracking so far. And you see hundreds of traces from the US, all e-waste, moving all over the world. You see to the east and to the west. Some of those traces are legal. You can actually sell electronics to other countries, but some of those are not. And so again, the idea that data can help us better understand what happens at the global scale and hence try to fix some of the loopholes we have. And the final thing we discovered was actually unexpected. It happened when a burglar came to our offices in Boston. And the poor guy stole a lot of things, including tags and computers that tell you where they go. And this is what happened. Well, so anyway, that was a long answer, so I used the opportunity to share a few more slides. But going back to your answer, there's many things we can measure. And again, sometimes you want to use data from cell phone is what some people call opportunistic data. Is data that's collected anyway, and you get hold of it and use it to understand the city. But in other cases, such as the one we just talked about, sometimes we want to actually instrument a track. We want to develop new sensors in order to understand the city. And again, if you look at all these projects with an impact on the community and what happens inside the city, life inside the city through different angles. Yes? Should we wait for the mic?
Barry Culper.
Thank you very, very much, Carlo, for the presentation and work. I wondered where or who are the important people doing work on the combinatory logics of data? In other words, billions of kinds of data that can curiosity cabinet-like be combined and certain kinds of intelligences gained from them. Who's doing the work about? In other words, you're showing things that are quite specific and homogeneous, let's say, relative to their familial linkages or possible linkages. Just wondering, are there people theorizing or positioning?
Yeah, totally. I think, how you combine different data sources and infuse them, right? And how you can put them together. Now, that's very interesting. And actually, if you think about, for instance, the data that your smartphone today collects, but the data I was saying before that nobody has access to but your cell phone provider or your operating system provider, Android or Apple. If you look at that data today combines many different type of information. And as you're saying, we're getting to a condition where potentially we could fuse data about all of these different dimensions. Now, the reason we haven't done it much is that, and actually we've done a theoretical paper was just published a few months ago, and I'll tell you about it in a moment. But the reason we haven't done it much is that to do that, the way you can do it to get the most value, you need to combine it to the individual. And to combine it to the individual, it means you need to have some kind of way to de-anonymize it. So if you just work on one dimension, think about cell phone data, then you can just take cell phone data, make all the provisions you can as a researcher to make sure that you aggregate it, anonymize it, and then get some useful insights about the city. But if you wanted to use, for instance, data from cell phone, and the data, say, from the city scanner we saw before, then somehow, or other data that's, maybe city scanner is not the right example, but if you want to combine different data sets, usually the individual is the integrator. And in order to do that, you somehow need to de-anonymize it in order to have the unit of aggregation, which is the individual, that puts together all the different sources. Now, I agree with you that that would give us much more insights because it puts different dimensions together. But again, the privacy implications are quite profound. Now, what we did in a paper that was published just a few months ago is actually show that you can combine different data sources without de-anonymizing. But again, that's a bit tricky. So what we've been doing, it's a paper where we use in Singapore, we use cell phone data, and also we use the data, how people move through the city with their smart mobility cars. And what you see is actually you can combine that information without de-anonymizing. Let me tell you, the basic idea is that, let me tell you, so today I flew in from Europe today, and I need to go to Boston. Unfortunately, too early because I'm teaching tomorrow. I would like to spend the whole day with you tomorrow. But basically, I left a few data points in Europe, here, and then in Boston. And so there's probably not that many people on the planet who have left the same traces. So when you look at this and you look at the traces we leave through smartphone, maybe credit card, and so on, you see that after a few days, there's only an individual who's done that kind of path, and then you can combine two data sets by using, just because they become unique, the only two that can be assigned to you are those two. So even without de-anonymizing the data set, you can combine it. Still, so we did a paper, we find it also problematic because then if you take data from whatever, Twitter, where many people leave location, you could de-anonymize with that. So you can actually use Twitter or Facebook or any other type of data sets you might have access to, some of them open data sets, in order to de-anonymize it, because if you use that and you know the person, then you can, even if the other trace is anonymized, you combine them, and once they're combined, that person will de-anonymize all the other data sets. I don't know if it was clear, but basically, so the short answer is that we haven't been doing too much of combining different data sets because of the privacy implications. Now, even if we demonstrated mathematically you can combine two data sets without de-anonymizing, it's enough that if you leave a third data set which is non-anonymized, even just Twitter, and then all your traces will be de-anonymized. So that's the paper we did a few months ago. But that's the reason I agree with you. It will give us a much better insight about human life in the city, but it has some issues from the point of view of where should we go in terms of privacy and so on. All right, yes.
Thank you. I have a curiosity about where we are looking at Senseable Lab and where we are looking at Carlo Ratti Associates. How did you make the difference in between the work for the lab, the work for your own office? What are the different projects? More the differences than the
Sure,
overlap?
yeah, totally.
And another one, how will José Luis Cerdá design Barcelona differently with all this data that we are providing?
Okay. The second question is wonderful to finish. So now, let me tell you about the first one. In the end, I only present the project from the lab. So what you saw here are all projects we're doing at the lab where we're using data for understanding space. I had initially done a presentation with two sides, that and then the other half about architecture, but I thought based on some of the initial feedback and talking about the ways, it was probably better to focus just on this. So I have not shown the projects that we do at the office, but the vision at the office is the same. We usually say, it's the same idea behind, is looking at this new world, at the convergence of digital and physical. And at the lab, we look at the research side of it. In the office, we look at the design side of it. And with startups, we look at the product side of it. And when something becomes, we've done a few startups dealing, for instance, with mobility and pedestrian mobility. One company is called Super Pedestrian. So is using some of the same things when they become a product or an app or something like that. So that's how we make the division. The division is quite clear also because a lot of the things we're doing in the office cannot be done at the university. At the university, you would not be able to design a neighborhood or a building. There's liability issues. So that's how we divided research, projects, and products. About the second part, I'd like to ask all of you, how would Cerdà design differently Barcelona? Well, one of the things I love, by the way, about Barcelona and Cerdà, and one of the most distinctive features which I find beautiful is that all of the corners of the buildings are cut at 45 degrees and create all these kind of myriad little squares. This big square, but also in between, at every intersection of the blocks are not square, but they have 45 degrees angle. And that initially was done because at the time they thought that the future would be all tramways. And to make it compatible with tramways, he said, I'm going to do all these 45 cuts. Now, it turns out that in the end, we had another mobility condition in the 20th century. We had a lot of cars, not that many tramways. So that wasn't used for what he initially imagined, but still became a beautiful, distinctive feature of Barcelona. And I think that's an important thing that's, data is great to understand how things are today. Design also looks at how things could be tomorrow. And some of that is unpredictable. The future, as Karl Popper in a very eloquent way put it, cannot be predicted just because we don't know the things that we will know tomorrow. And so in the future, we will all build it today, all build it from today onwards together. So the first thing I would like to say is that, still, having data doesn't mean a deterministic design. And design which is looking into the future makes some assumption and sometimes also mistake that turns out, like in the case of Cerdà, to become very beautiful feature of the city. But I think what probably he would have done, I'm trying to guess, is to set up a constant way of monitoring the city and how people live in it. And probably instead of planning the whole of Barcelona in its development for the following 50 years, he might have developed an adaptive model where perhaps after 5 years he might have seen that the way of living in the blocks, in the super blocks or in the blocks, the way of behaving that was monitored could lead to a form that would evolve over time. So I think probably we would have created a more adaptive system. And I think that probably that's what we can do today with data is really to use that information that comes in real time to create an architecture that's more similar to what we have in nature, to systems that resemble more the living dynamic systems that we have in nature, a city that can respond to us in a better way. People sometimes say that architecture is a third skin. We got our own skin and the skin of our clothes, and then the skin of architecture. But if you think about this, in the past, has been quite uncompromising, has been like a corset. And I think perhaps tomorrow we can look at data and real-time data to create an architecture that responds to us in a flexible, dynamic way that can better respond to our dreams and desires. Thanks.